Good afternoon, everybody. Well, we've had so much rain in the past 24 hours. Rain, rain, rain. It's flushed everybody and flushed everybody and flushed everybody. I've also been feeding and feeding too. I've fed twice in the past 24 hours. Um, I know that seems like a lot, but I'm not in bark or moss. I'm in intermediates. It flushes through easier. It also doesn't retain much. At the same time, ask yourself, an orchid hanging on a tree in the wild, does it have any control over its nutrients coming to it? Can it stop the nutrient flow and just say, well, I just want water the next couple of times, just fresh water, but just hold on to nutrients? No, it just gets nutrients every time it rains. Excuse me. Every time it rains, it gets nutrients brought to it every single time. They get fed, they get flushed, they get fed, and they get flushed and fed and flushed. And that's kind of what I'm mimicking outside, and it's working wonderfully. Let me show you real quick before I forget. This is going to save me, hopefully just, let me put you on the tripod too. This is that garden lime I'm using, that Espoma garden lime. All right. And again, I'm not the only person who's been using this stuff. Somebody reminded me, Ed's Orchids, one of my favorite channels. That man's forgotten more about orchids than I'll ever know. He uses natural products like blood and bone meal and stuff like that on his plants all the time, and he's talking about them all the time and showing the results. A wealth of information. Anyway, this is what I'm doing with it. Just like that. And that's all I'm doing. I'm just sprinkling around the pots. Again, I just take, it's probably, if you measured it out, it's probably a third of a teaspoon to a half of a teaspoon, a third to a half of a teaspoon, you know. And I'm sprinkling it around the pots. I'm not putting it on the foliage. It does get stuck on the roots occasionally. Sorry about the bang. It does get stuck on a root occasionally, especially if it's a wet root. But if it does, you can just give it a little bit of water, splash it with a little bit of water to get it off the roots if you want to. But I haven't had any adverse effects. It's liable to make a little spot on a root or something if a big piece of it gets stuck to a root, possibly. Try it on a few plants and see how it works for you. I love this stuff. I'm applying it actually now for about the second time. The first time was about 4 weeks ago, and on some of the pots, I'm probably going to stick to about once a month, sprinkle this on them. Some of the bigger pots that have larger media that flush through a little bit easier, maybe a little bit more. But anyway, that's how I apply it. It's just that simple. And at that point, they can get all the calcium and all the magnesium they want on their own. They can kind of self-feed. Thank you for all the great questions and all the great comments on that. One of the viewers asked a really good question. I wanted to touch on. I don't want this video to go too long. We've got more rain coming too, by the way, and they're going to get fed again. But right now, by the way, I'm feeding. I was about 185, 190, almost 200 parts per million. It was about 80 to 90 parts per million of CalMag. The rest of it was Better Grow, and the last 30 or 40 parts per million was some kelp and seaweed mixed in, and that's what I fed them. And that's what I'm going to do again when I spray them later on tonight, probably. But the question was, if calcium is supposed to be absorbed between 5 and 5.8, then why are we're putting the garden lime on there, which is keeping the pH around neutral or 7? How is it absorbing calcium? How is that calcium, all that calcium being absorbed? And what a great question. I'm sure there's a lot of people wondering the exact same thing, and this is the stuff that makes me happy. This makes, one, somebody's been listening to what we've been talking about and is thinking and has immediately noticed a conflict or there's definitely a conflict of information there, right? Definitely. That makes me happy. And it's, again, this is not my field of expertise, growing. I'm a structural engineer. I used to build hospitals for a living. This is more of a hobby, but I'll do my best. We think of orchids more in the hydroponic range because of how they grow. They're more bare root, and their absorption ranges for nutrients are more in the acidic range, more in hydroponic ranges, like you feed other hydroponic plants. A tomato plant grown in soil, those nutrients are not absorbed in the same ranges as the same tomato plant grown in hydroponics. The hydroponic nutrients are more easily absorbed, and they're usually absorbed in a different range than in soil. One of the easiest ways to put the answer to this in perspective is if you go look at your pH chart that I showed everybody one time. I'll try and remember to get the link up at the bottom of this. If you look at the left side, it's got hydroponic, and on the right side, it's soil. But if you look at all the bars and they're positioned and they're positioned to each other on the graph on the chart, and look at side to side, they almost mirror each other. On the soil side, they might be a little bit longer because they're absorbed in a little bit wider ranges, and they're also, the entire group of bars has shifted up to a little bit higher pH levels, but basically it's all still in the same position, kind of all except for one. If you look at that chart, which element there, which mineral there, which nutrient there is not, which one has changed position completely from one side to the other, from hydroponic to soil? Calcium. In hydroponics, calcium is absorbed between 5 and 5.8. In soil, it's absorbed more around 6.3, 6.4, up to like 9. All right? Now, this is not full-on hydroponics, and we are relying on, when we feed calcium nitrate, a more pure form of calcium, it's absorbed more readily into the plant, and it shows up in the plant very, very quickly because of it's a more soluble form of calcium. Calcium carbonate, more like what we're getting in this lime mix or something, isn't as soluble. We've spoken about that before, because calcium carbonates are like what you get in your tap water, right? But you get other things in your tap water as well. Calcium carbonate, when you put tap water on your soil, the microbial activity breaks it down in a form that the plants can absorb it. It takes a couple of weeks, but then they start to break it down. This does the same thing. Our plants even better grow when they take their plants in the beginning, early spring is what they said. They take their plants and they repot them. So they're taking one out of bark, which has fauna on it, getting the old bark off, put it in a new pot, fresh bark around it, top dressing it with the lime, and it's ready to go. But it's taking fauna with it. As long as they're not, spraying it with hydrogen peroxide or Physan, and I'm not pointing fingers at people, and I'm not trying to start a problem or an argument here, and killing off all the fauna on the root mass, they're just transferring fauna from one pot to another, and it just takes right off and keeps on going. If you kill that fauna off, they're going to have a little more of a hesitation. It's going to take them longer to recover and to get going again, and to be able to start absorbing nutrients. Some of the nutrients, because of the form they were in, are absorbed very quickly, yes. This type of product doesn't absorb like calcium nitrate does. This one is broken down by some of the fauna in our pots, and so it breaks down over a period of a couple of weeks, and then it starts to release. And at that point, it's there all the time for them to be able to absorb, and we just keep applying it, just keep replenishing it. But it takes a little process. It has a little process to go through naturally in our pots, so they can get broke down in our baskets. Not that many people talk about fauna or microbial activity in orchids that much. We're concentrating on getting our roots to grow and our shoots not to die and our leaves to look right, and blooms to come out. We're not really getting to it that deep. Not that many people are. Again, not that many people are as intense about nutrients as I am. Regardless, I hope that explains how that works. Even though these are hydroponic and you can use calcium nitrate on that, calcium nitrate is more absorbed around 5 to 5.8, and that, because it's a more pure form of calcium, it needs to be applied to be able to be absorbed better. It needs to be applied more in that range. This being calcium carbonate, and I've said before, is not a water-soluble source. It has to be broken down over a period of time. When you put this on your orchids, you're not going to get an instant response like you would with calcium nitrate. And calcium nitrate has its place, but you can really do harm with orchids. You have to be cautious with it. It has to have lots of other nutrients along with it in a good balance, or you get weird growth. This will give a lot of magnesium and a lot of calcium in a soluble form, but it just takes a little while to get going. Once it gets going, it's releasing slowly all the time, all the time, all the time. Kind of like eggshells a little bit. Eggshells won't provide as much calcium as this will, and don't usually have as magnesium in anywhere near these amounts. But is a soluble form of calcium after it breaks down a little bit. But you can't take a plant that has a calcium deficiency and put this lime on it and expect it to just immediately start doing better. It's going to take a week or so or two, depending on the pot. If it's been freshly potted, it may take even longer. If it's a plant that's been sitting in here for a year like this one, I sprinkle on it, I get activity pretty quick because there's stuff in there that's just ready to break things down. It's been established for a little while, if that makes sense. Anyway, we don't talk about fauna like that because that's more soil talk. That's more talking like you would in soil. And we're not growing in soil, so it doesn't get spoken about a lot, but that's kind of how this is working. And if you look at the pH absorption range for calcium in soil, it's 6.3, 6.4 up to 9. So when this keeps it around neutral, it's getting plenty of calcium. And actually, it's a perfect pH range to keep this stuff in, and at the same time when the nutrients hit it, it drops it down in the low 6s where plants like to absorb. Hope that makes sense. I'm just doing my best to answer the questions. I hope that helps. And I'm really impressed with the way this stuff is working and how it's going to continue to work, I think. It just makes a lot of good sense too. And again, I'm just playing catch up. But I'm getting lots and lots of big growths and multiple growths, and you know, that's just going to make for that much better bloom, right? So let me get to it. We got weather coming still, and I want to try and enjoy my evening. Hope you do the same. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for all those great questions.